I said in the previous video that once I hit 100 subscribers, I'll say subscribe 50 times. I decided to say subscribe 100 times now because I hit 100 subscribers. But then, now I've got 115 subscribers, so I'm gonna say subscribe 115 times. This is gonna be a long video, so sit down and subscribe. Subscribe, 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 first 10, subscribe, 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 I can't speak. Subscribe, I actually can't speak. Subscribe, I can't speak. This is gonna be a long video. Sorry. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Verse 40. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 50. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribed, subscribe, silence it. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I don't know what I've done. I probably counted this all wrong. I may as well go to 150 so I make sure I've done enough. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I actually can't do this. Chug Sprite, subscribe, 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 like, subscribe, 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 subscribe. For the 100th one, you just subscribe. 3, 2, 1. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. You should be subscribed. Subscribe. I'm past 115 now. I'm gonna go up to maybe not 150, 130. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribed, subscribe, 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 SpongeBob Under the Sea. Tell me in the comments how much I actually did say subscribe. And then just subscribe, please. I did this for you guys. Bye.